The disc came loose with a sharp, wet crack. Jura, Morrow's hands closed around obsidian that still breathed sea foam, and a rival lantern flared at the cave mouth. Suspicion tightened his jaw as Marin shouted from the lip of the cave, "Hands off that disc, Dr. Morrow." He felt the salt cold on his knuckles, and the disc etched lines under his fingertips. Within the first minutes, the problem was plain. The map had drawn other people to the cavern, and the choice of who would read it would be contested. He hauled the disc into the shallow light and did not let go. Water ran in rivulets from the carved grooves and pooled in his palm. Dra. Morrow's posture was rigid. His right thumb traced a thin star line and his left hand kept the astrolabe from slipping. He did not yet know whether the pattern would yield a star chart or a ritual script. Assistant Lyra gripped his elbow hard enough to leave marks. Dr. Morrow, the lantern, Lyra. Her voice was high with a mix of wonder and alarm. He let her speak and watched the cave mouth where Captain Soren's figure leaned with a pistol, level posture, and Marin's silhouette shifted like a collector deciding. In the next sentences, Morrow established his baseline work through movement. He checked the brass astrolabes pivot, wiped the disc with a scrap of cloth, and flipped his spectacles down to read the closest itching. He had spent 20 years cataloging ritual objects. His hands remembered catalog numbers and shelf codes, even when the sea had tried to rewrite them. He moved with a practical calm. Suspicion steered his choice to secure the object rather than bargain for its sale. That practical decision governed the rest of the night. The cave mouth smelled of wet stone and smoked rope. Marin's voice rose. "We finish this and it goes to Marin's house, not some scholar's trunk." She spoke quick. Sharp words that aimed to shift the moment into commerce. "Marin, Captain Soren, not while my boat holds the crew." Conversation became negotiation. Negotiation turned to demand. Dr. Morrow answered with action, not talk. He set the disc on a slab, positioned the astrolabe over the star lines and rotated it until a faint, phosphorescent alignment shimmered across the grooves. The alignment was not static. The etchings slid, almost imperceptibly, and a new shape formed, a city silhouette traced within the pattern. Lyra caught her breath and knocked a pebble into the pooling water. The high priest of the deep watched from the rim of Morrow's vision, a memory echo, at first only a thinned gesture of weight and posture, then an outline with braided white hair and a circlet. The spectre did not speak in words. It arranged light and the astrolabe's shadow into a slow, ordered motion that resembled counting. Morrow felt an emotion shift in the way his hands tightened then slowed. His earlier suspicion bent toward focused wonder as he realized the disc encoded behavior, not geography. He set the astrolabe and spoke, short lines to keep the argument practical. "Lyra, hold the lamp steady, Dr. Morrow, this could be a chart." "Lara, chart or chant," Morrow answered. Marin barked a laugh that had edge. Captain Soren stepped forward, his boots scraping rock. Words escalated into a public clash over ownership and ethics. At the makeshift camp on black sand, the argument sharpened. Marin put the disc on an oilcloth and slapped her palm on top. "You want to read it, you pay me for access," she said. "Marin, that's theft." Captain Soren replied, "Soren, this is profit." Marin, voice flat with certainty. Dr. Morrow watched both and counted motives. Marin wanted income. Soren wanted his crew's safety and share. Lyra wanted preservation. He tried to steer the moment by naming the practical problem aloud. "If you move it now, the surf will reach the etchings. If you sell it, you break an archive that might still speak." His voice held a measured urgency. They argued in short bursts. Marin, "Don't touch Lyra." "Soren, we need a secure table." Morrow, "Dr. Morrow, you always talk about archives." Marin snapped. "Marin, my work preserves context," he answered. The exchange contained 3 brisk turns, then a brief silence as the tide hissed nearer. The dispute revealed how fragile the disc was, and that time worked against every option. Morrow decided to attempt a controlled reading. He set a ritual circle of sand on the beach, placed the disc in the center, and anchored the astrolabe over its etched star lines with strips of oilcloth. None of his movements were theatrical. They were precise surgical motions born from long practice. As he turned the astrolabe, the etched lines resisted. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the disc flared along one thin groove, projecting a narrow band of light that slid across the sand and rearranged the grains into a small, compass-like pattern. The high priest of the deep shifted from a watchful outline to a clearer presence. He did not touch the living researchers. Instead, he made gestures that matched the astrolabe's motion. Lyra's breath hitched. She wiped her palm against her thigh. The spectre offered a series of incantatory hand positions that corresponded to specific itchings on the disc. Morrow executed the positions by imitating the motions. Thumb along the third star line, index over the coral sigil, then the astrolabe's pin rotated so that the compass pointed to a single notch. The disc presented a mnemonic, a sequence of simple physical actions paired with the astrolabe's bearings. It was not a narrative. It was an instruction set. Morrow understood that the priests had built a bodily memory into the map. Steps to rehearse under the stars so the community could recall their cosmology without written text. This recognition changed the terms of the debate. Preservation alone would not suffice. The map demanded ritual to hold its content. Marin watched, jaw tight. It speaks. She asked Marin, "Don't he say that?" Soren replied sharply, "Data Morrow, if it is ritual, who owns it?" Marin. Morrow looked at her and then at the disc. He felt another emotion shift. Wonder hardened into fear as he realized that activating the mnemonic could bind living memory to whoever completed it. He tapped his pen against the notebook, a habitual pacing move when decisions carried consequence. Outside pressure rose. Lanterns bobbed from the rival boat at the cove mouth. Someone called a name that none of them recognized. Marin's hands tightened around the oilcloth. Soren shifted his weight toward his pistol. The group had to make a choice. Perform the mnemonic now and risk changing who held authority, or fragment and hide the disc and risk losing access to its method of remembering. The argument moved into rapid back and forth. We perform it and keep it. Morrow, Marin, you won T. Duh. Morrow, you re asking for secrecy. Marin interrupted. Soren, control your people. Morrow snapped, voice low. I will not have the disc walked away. Soren answered. We stay here and we decide. Lyra, voice steady. The exchange held 5 turns that landed on a single tension point. Whether to bind the map's memory. At dawn, Marin lunged. She slid her hand under the oilcloth and tried to yank the disc. The move was sudden enough that Lyra stumbled and the disc tipped. Surf hit the edge of the camp and the oilcloth tore. The object skittered toward lapping water, and a wave dragged it into the shallows where it hit a submerged rock and wedged. Salt smeared the etchings and a line of coral began to wrap the disc's rim. Everyone reacted with immediate, concrete motion. Marin. Soren shouted and reached. His arm struck her shoulder. Morrow dove forward, palms skidding on wet sand. Lyra kicked at the surf to reach the disc. The disc itself answered with motion. Under the water, some star lines glowed and then blurred as salt dissolved a thin channel. This was the chapter's midline cliffhanger. Would the disc be reclaimed intact or torn irreparably by salt and collectors? Morrow fought the tide and the people's hands. The ocean pushed like a blunt force against his ribs. He kept his chin tucked and his arms steady. He felt a sharp taste of metal and sea, and a sudden wave of nausea as the disc's alignment flickered. In that instant, Morrow's earlier fear swung into a cold clarity. He pulled the astrolabe free of the sand and slammed it over the disc, completing the alignment sequence he had practiced minutes before. The astrolabe sank into the grooves and the disc's light anchored to one precise star. The ritual reaction was immediate and violent. The high priest of the deep intensified. Waves rose against the cliff, not high but forceful enough to tear sand loose. The spectre's voice, if voice is the right word, pressed against Morrow's skull as aligned instruction. Marin screamed and tried to wrench the disc. Soren shoved her back. Lyra grabbed Morrow's sleeve and held him upright as the astrolibis pin drove the pattern to completion. Chitra. Morrow spoke a short sequence of commands learned from the shape of the pattern. His words were concrete, not elegy. Anchor the pin, pull the cord. He followed each motion. His fingers bled from salt on the rope, and the disc flared white. Then a focused memory entered him as a set of images. The priest touching a circled star, a small child learning a chant while tracing a coastal reef, the order repeating a short set of hand positions at sunrise. The images were not described as fragments. They were precise actions he could reproduce. Blow the conch twice, tilt the astrolabe east, press bone amulet to forehead. The transfer caused a physical reaction. Morrow staggered, a searing clarity across his temples, and collapsed onto the wet sand with the taste of brine in his mouth. His breathing came in sharp, measured pulls. Lyra knelt beside him, fingers beneath his jaw. "Judah Morrow, speak to me," she said. He blinked and held the images like a newly learned manual. Marin stared, stunned, while Soren gathered the disc and tucked it against his chest as though carrying a living child. In the immediate aftershock, Marin fled, her face marked by salt and shame. Soren averted his eyes and shouldered the damaged disc toward his boat. Lyra sat on the damp sand and pressed her palm to her mouth as if testing the air. Morrow rose slowly and, to steady himself, set the brass astrolabe on his palm and traced the sequence he had received. The astrolabe's brass bore the imprint of salt and coral. He put the gestures into his notebook, writing short commands and exact timings. Conch twice. Tilt astrolabe 5 degrees east. Hold breath on the third step. Press bone amulet to temple. For exactly 3 seconds, Morrow's suspicion had guided him to secure the disc. Wonder had allowed him to attempt the reading. Fear had kept his hands from performing foolishly. Clarity had recorded the mnemonic. Those emotional shifts were visible. His jaw unclenched, then tightened, then relaxed into methodical action. He did not narrate emotion. He corrected the astrolabe's pin, sealed wounds with cloth, and wrote with a deliberate hand. Soren argued for immediate departure. "Soren, we cannot sail with that undamaged." Marin cried from the path toward the boat. "Marin, you tried to steal it," Soren replied. The exchange contained the required rapid back and forth of accusation and defense, 3 to 5 turns that changed the group's direction. In the end, Soren decided to bring the disc aboard for safekeeping. Marin refused to look at him as she went. Lyra stayed and helped Morrow wash the worst of the salt from the grooves. A smaller twist appeared when Morrow examined the disc more closely. A faint abrasion along the third concentric ring matched a burn mark on the rim of the brass astrolabe he had set down a year earlier at a dig. That coincidence suggested prior contact between this map and his equipment, an unexpected link that changed his understanding of the disc's provenance. It implied that someone in his network had handled the disc before, or that the priests had used a tool identical to his astrolabe. The realization altered his plan. This was not an isolated artifact. It had intersected with his work before. Morrow recorded the new detail with one deliberate sentence and then dictated a short protocol for Lyra. "Lyra, copy these steps exactly and hide the notebook in the satchel under the wet clothes," he said. "Lyra, I will not let it be sold," she replied. He sealed the notebook with black wax, pressed the brass astrolabe into the wrap, and felt a small, private resolve form in the motion of his hands. They left the beach with the disc lashed into a canvas satchel, coral edges dark and alive. Marin rowed ahead toward the longboat without a word. Soren's shoulders were set like an oarlock. Lyra carried the smaller satchel that held the astrolabe and the notebook. Morrow's steps were slow. Each time the boat rocked, he checked the satchel straps. The group had resolved the chapter's immediate conflict. The mnemonic had been activated and a portion of the priesthood's ritual had lodged in Morrow's practical memory, while the physical map remained damaged but recoverable. The closing scene played out in the damp light of dawn. Morrow sat on the low cliff and opened his notebook to a single page he had just written. He read the brief commands aloud, testing cadence and timing. Lyra watched the pages as if watching a patient. "De tomorrow," she said. "What now?" He did not offer a vow or a philosophy. He answered with a logistical decision. "We catalogue, we hide, and we teach only through the ritual steps until we assess the danger." He folded the page, pressed the black wax seal, and pocketed it. The final beat landed on a concrete action rather than a speech. Morrow handed the sealed notebook to Lyra and pointed toward the boat. The ocean hissed under the hull. He felt the memory still burning under his skin, precise and immovable. The conch blow at sunrise, the tilt of the astrolabe, the pressure of bone to temple. He accepted that knowledge and took practical measures. The dawn widened. Soren pushed the boat into the surf. Maren sat with her chin tucked and hands knotted. Lyra secured the satchel with knots Morrow had taught her. Morrow watched the single star still faint on the waterline and then stepped into the boat, his hand on the satchel, his face set for what would come next. Maren lunged across the low rail and closed her fingers on the obsidian rim. Elias's hand slammed into hers and the disc rotated against Morrow's palms. Water spattered across their shirts. "Hands off that disc," Maren snapped, and her voice cut the night so quickly. Morrow's suspicion hardened into action. He pressed his body over the object, refusing to let any other hand touch the wet stone. The skiff pitched, and the lantern at the bow winked as a wave brushed them. In those first seconds the central problem declared itself. Whoever left the disc would lose the priesthood, some mnemonic to force. Morrow kept his chin down and his fingers flat against the etched lines. He smelled salt and lantern oil and the faint, sweet tang of the disc surface. He remembered how the disc had come loose from the cave mouth a day earlier, a sharp, wet crack in the rock, and how Maren had shouted the same warning then. That memory stung like a fresh blister. The wet disc incident had ended with a rival lantern flaring at the cave entrance and a small argument that nearly cost them the relic. Now, under the low moon, Maren was the first to act and Elias the first to steal. Suspicion drove his hold. He would not trade the object for rhetoric. Elias grunted and shoved. "Give it here, Morrow." "You don't know what it does, Elias, breath hot, you and your books." Morrow felt the shove in his ribs. He tightened his knees against the skiff's planks and set his jaw. "Elias, release it now," he said. His voice stayed low, measured, and the words were instructions, not questions. The skiff cut a dark line along the cove. Maren's hands trembled where they touched the disc. Sea spray purled on the etched grooves. Salt water beaded across the obsidian and, as the boat rolled, faint silver threads ran along the incisions. The lines brightened, then slid like fish between ribs and reassembled into new angles. Maren sucked in a breath and let the disc rise slightly. The constellations rearranged. Every head turned toward the pattern and, for the first time on the water that night, the group's posture changed from argument to study. It shifted. "Maren." Her voice dropped to a whisper that still broke the hush. "It moves with water." Elias laughed, a short, sharp sound, "so it answers the sea." "Sell it to a captain, Morrow. Sell it and buy 1,000 maps." Professor Havel's shadow at the stern tightened. He had come aboard at Durar. Morrow's summons in the cave, pale under his oilskin, not a trinket, Havel, a procedure. A mnemonic tied to motion. The first emotion, shift, came then. Suspicion leached into doubt. Morrow had expected resistance. He had not expected the earnestness that spread across Havel's face. He felt the doubt physically. A small looseness at the back of his neck where certainty had sat. He forced his fingers into the etch and tested the lines with a fingertip, watching how the star lines thickened under moisture and recomposed. They did not only rearrange symbols, they sketched angles that suggested roots, faint keels of architecture under a glaze. The map did something no parchment could. It reconfigured to active conditions. They argued in short lines, each sentence a tool. "Professor, explain." "Dear Morrow." "Havel, tell us what you see." "Not see," Havel replied. Read, the lines match soundings from a ledger I found in a breaker chest. The shapes align with harbor cuts and reef teeth. This is navigation by constancy. Navigation for whom? Elias cut in, for drownings or for pilots? For both, Havel, for a priesthood that recorded a city into the sky so sailors could remember skeletal streets when the waters rose. The word city changed the mood again. Marin's grip tightened. She had family who owed passage notes to coastal captains. Havel's claim pushed the central conflict from academic curiosity to a practical race. Control of the disk could turn memory into rote and rote into advantage. They reached the abandoned lighthouse and carried the damp disk up narrow iron steps. Lantern light fell in hard circles, salt dripped from tassels and boots. The lantern room smelled of oil and boiled rope. Jar. Morrow set the disk on the waxed railing and unfolded his brass astrolabe. He kept speaking in the clipped voice he used when making field entries. We record, then we decide. One touch at a time, Havel slapped his palm flat against the map to steady it. No, we test. We see what happens when we simulate tides. Marin watched both men. Marin watches. Marin says we lock it if it proves dangerous, she added. The group moved into theory with hands and paper. Drer. Morrow pointed questions and wrote answers in the field notebook with a pen quickened by urgency. The dialogue in the lantern room became sharp and efficient. A bench of tools where each spoke to different stakes. If the map is mnemonic, Havel, it is meant to be active. It is intended to be read by movement. Whoever holds motion will hold history that turns knowledge into weapon, Elias, and weapons into coin. Marin's reply was a low sound that held both fear and determination. Then we hide it, not sell it. They began testing by tilting the disk, pouring measured curls of water across particular sigils, and recording the resulting constellations. When Marin set the disk on its side, a line of stars uncoiled and formed a faint silhouette. The silhouette took the unmistakable shape of piled terraces and archways stacked like ribs. Professor Havel leaned forward until his forehead nearly touched the stone. He mapped a finger along the new arrangement. That's a plan of the lower quarter, Havel whispered. Look, there's a harbor basin at the center, and a line of beacons to the west. This is not cosmology alone, it is cartography for the drowned. His voice narrowed into disbelief and then into hunger. That hunger altered his manners. He began to argue differently. His sentences shortened and sharpened into demands. Give it to me, Morrow. We can reconstruct the charts. Think of what we could recover. Think of routes for salvage. Elias echoed him with hard eyes. Yes. Morrow, give it to Havel. He knows what to do. The room split into two motions. Those who wanted access for study and those whose study had already become a plan for leverage. A second emotion, shift arrived with the city silhouette. Doubt turned into fear. The fear showed in small, concrete ways. Marin's hands went clammy. Professor Havel's foot began tapping a rhythmless beat on the floor. Elias's jaw tightened until the vein showed. Drer. Morrow felt the fear in his mouth as the salt on the disc tasted metallic. He moved to keep control, and his movements grew precise. He aligned the astrolabe rim with the disc's center, measured an angle, and muttered notes into his notebook. Do not touch without consent, Dr. Morrow. The sentence was both instruction and warning. Marin answered. Marin will not let them take it. Elias shoved forward then, hands reaching for the disc in one fast motion. He tried to wrench it free. Dr. Morrow braced with both arms, and the first physical scuffle of the night's second half began. They toppled toward the terrace door. Elias' elbow grazed the threshold, and the sound of his scuffle with the disc collided with a wet metallic shriek from the lighthouse lens. The glass threw a fractured beam across the water. For an instant no one spoke. Then, where Elias' hand had closed on the obsidian, a thin film of iridescence formed and a smell like rotted kelp poured into the air. The high priest of the deep manifested, first as an imprint of sand on the railing, then as a figure stepping through the reek. The spectre moved without weight. Salt flecked his robes and his circlet held wet beads. He laid a conch-topped staff across the disc with a fingertip that left a line of coral dust. Dra. Morrow heard Marin suck in a breath. "Stop," the spectre said, not in words they understood, but in a timbre that made Elias' muscles lock. The voice carried layered echoes like small choirs underwater. Elias's grip faltered. Elias screamed and pushed, and the spectre stepped forward into the cliff wind. Hands met on polished stone. The disc slid. For a beat the world narrowed to the sound of splintering wood, and shouted names. Elias. Man. Morrow. And then the terrace gave to a concrete event. Elias tumbled over the rail and hit the surf with a sound like a fallen bell. The salt residue from the spectre splashed across the cliff and laid a wet, luminous crust along the rock. Dra. Morrow lunged to the rail and reached. He felt Elias' fingers, slick and then gone. The sea claimed a hand and a scream. The climax was immediate and brutal. The group moved with the same choreography of grief and calculation that had marked their earlier argument. Marin's voice cut into the wind. He grabbed me, he pulled me. She wrenched at her sleeve where a long bruise bruised across her forearm. Havel shouted for a rope. Juta Morrow barked orders and then hesitated, staring at the disc where the spectre had left coral, like growths at its edge. He saw that the astrolabe he had set aside now held a smear of salt that matched the disc's new lines. The spectre's intervention had cost Elias his body and left behind a relic, the brass astrolabe with a thin line of coral that fit the disc stitchings. After the fall they discovered precisely what the spectre had taken as payment. The iridescent residue crept along Elias' sleeve where it touched the water. When the tide slid back, only a smear remained and a line of small bubbles. The group watched the sea take and only return a story. The sudden loss made decisions more urgent. Juta Morrow's face tightened, his breathing came in short counts. The fear that had settled into the room now pointed him toward one concrete choice: bind or lose. He laid out a ritual that was neither ceremony nor scholarship alone. He wrote steps as if they were field instructions. Boil seawater with beeswax, warm the disc on a hollow of black iron, set the astrolabe to the exact angle that the spectre had marked, and seal the disc in wax and linen. He described each step aloud and had Marin repeat them. Marin, hold this edge. Havel, the astrolabe and matches. Elias, he stopped at Elias' name because Elias was gone and air filled the gap. Elias is gone. Marin. She closed her mouth like a seal. They worked through Prue, dawn with method and haste. Havel argued about the correctness of coils and the angle of the astrolabe. No, Havel, due after Morrow sharply, the angle is 92 degrees, not 89. Trust the field notes. Havel's voice tightened and then slid into compliance. The argument yielded at 3 rapid exchanges where they corrected an alignment. The ritual had to be precise, and precision meant control. The group moved in practiced, rehearsed motions. Pour, heat, press, fold. Marin wrapped the disc in linen saturated with a measured ratio of wax and salt. The cloth sealed with a pressing of Juta Morrow's black wax seal ring. The third emotion, shift, arrived as action produced resolve. Where suspicion had protected and fear had hollowed, resolve now hammered decisions into place. Juta Morrow chose secrecy over publication. He insisted that Havel not go to ports with the disc's notes. He ordered Marin to carry the sealed object to a specific headland, where the sea had once been shallow. He spoke in decisive sentences. Marin will place it at the root rock. She will return and report. No ledger copies leave this lighthouse. Marin did not speak. She moved as ordered and tucked the sealed disc under her coat. Professor Havel did not accept the decision quietly. He stormed across the lantern room, grabbed his satchel, and threw down a ledger that had been opened to coordinates. "You are burying knowledge," he said. "You are choosing fear over reconstruction, and you are choosing profit." Elias' absence seemed to answer through Marin's pale face. Havel slung the satchel onto his shoulder and left the lighthouse without unpacking the ledger. He slammed the door and the sound made all of them flinch. His departure fractured the small alliance they had formed. His choices would later mark him as the man who wanted recovery more than safety. They recorded the altered star lines with care. Dra. Morrow wrote step by step entries into the field notebook. Times, angles, degrees of salt used, the tick of the astrolabe wheel. He labored over words so that anyone reading later would understand the mechanical way the map responded. He catalogued the spectrus residues and the precise choral pattern impressed on the astrolabe. He did not write motivations, he wrote procedures. This kept emotion at bay and turned grief into usable record. That afternoon, Morrow sat alone in a cramped study that smelled of beeswax smoke, and old paper. He braced the field notebook on his knees and read aloud to steady his voice. Sealed at first light, angle 92. Wax ratio 1:4. Astrolabe imprint corresponds to notch 4. Marin will carry the sealed disc to the root rock. Havel has abandoned the project. Elias was lost to the surf. He read and then recorded corrections. The ritual had saved the disc from immediate theft, but it had exacted a cost. He traced the ink smear left by his thumb and found the salt still faint on his skin. Outside, gulls screamed and a net creaked down at the harbor. Marin returned with a wet line across her wrist and a stitched cut where the terrace had snagged her. She sat without speaking and placed a wet hand on the same page de Morrow had marked. They shared the quiet of two people who had carried a weight and come back slightly hollowed. The quiet held the memory of Elia's S-fall, but it also anchored the next moves. They had protected a fragment of the priesthood's memory, bound it to the sea as it had once been bound, and created a new obligation. Marin must carry the sealed object toward the headland by night and leave it where the tide would claim it temporarily. They planned logistics in spare, efficient language. Havel's ledger would remain at the lighthouse for now. de Morrow would keep the astrolabe in his satchel. They agreed on a single chain of custody. Marin objected to secrecy then, not with speeches but with a single practical question. If the map changes with the sea, how will Marin know when it has become readable again? Morrow answered by showing her the field notes and the aligning notch on the astrolabe. He showed her where to set the angle and how long to wait to let the water pattern form. He trained her hands with quick motions and made her speak the steps back. They closed the chapter with small, concrete acts. Marin dressed the sealed linen in a leather sling and checked the knot twice. Professor Havel's departure left bitter prints in the ledger pages they had gummed shut. Morrow placed the brass astrolabe on his desk and thumbed the choral line until it clicked under his nail. He made a final entry that evening: secrecy chosen, cost, 1 life and the reputation of the project, priority. Preservation over disclosure. He folded the page and tucked the ledger into a drawer. He did not write that he felt hollow. Instead, he tied a practical knot on the leather satchel and forced himself to sleep. Later, when he woke, he rehearsed the ritual steps in a whisper and then laid them out again on a clean page. He counted off the doses, the degrees, and the exact quarter turn of the astrolabe. He would reconstruct the mnemonic from these notes and from the small residue that the spectre had left behind. He knew each recovered line would demand a sacrifice of sorts. He set the field notebook by the lamp and polished his spectacles until the rim blurred. At dawn, Marin shouldered the sling and walked to the cliff with the sealed disc pressed to her ribs. The sky held low clouds and a thin light, not a promise but a mechanical fact. She moved with a practical gait. Morrow watched her until she reached the headland, and then turned away to his desk to label the pages. They had preserved the map for now. They had lost Elias. They had lost Havel's cooperation. The last image of the chapter is Marin placing the sealed disc at the root rock and stepping back as the tide reached, her fingers white against the leather strap. The ocean accepted the object and the water lapped over the linen and wax. Marin did not speak. She tightened her jaw and began the measured walk back toward the lighthouse. That physical step, placing the disc into its temporary custody, closed the chapter's immediate conflict and set a clear, operational problem for the next. How to reconstruct the priesthood's chart without losing more lives. Moro returned to his study, hands stained with wax and salt. He tested one more hypothesis on the astrolabe and wrote the result. Then he locked the drawer with the ledger and sat in silence for a small, necessary amount of time. He did not conclude with a meditation. He concluded with a concrete beat. A single rap at the lighthouse door that he heard as he put the field notebook away. He stood, took his coat, and walked toward the sound. The chapter ends on that rap, not on a thought, and the knock promises the next concrete event to be faced. Emotion roots suspicion. Emotion shifts suspicion to doubt, doubt to fear, fear to resolve. Marin's fingers closed on the obsidian rim, and the disc flashed under her palm. Suspicion pushed Moro forward before thought could steady him. He moved to take the disc, and his sleeve caught wet stone. Hands off that disc. Marin snapped, voice hard enough that the wind cut in on it. Elias planted both feet on the cliff and said nothing, but his hands reached for the brass astrolabe at his belt. The argument made the choice plain. Someone would activate the disc or let it slip into the sea. Moro's suspicion had been building since the first crack under the cave. He remembered the wet snap when the disc came loose. Remembered Marin's sudden exclamation and Elias's grab. That memory tightened the line between care and obsession in him. He kept his hold and breathed salt and cold and the smell of rubbed brass. He had come to the cliff because the disc would only sing where the sky met the sea. He stayed because he did not trust Marin or Elias to hold the map's terrible accuracy with the discipline it required. Marin stepped closer, shoulder brushing Moro's elbow. The disc left a smear of sea. "Slick on her gloves, we can use it tonight," she said. "If we don't tell a line now, the tide will hide the markers." Her voice had no pleading in it. Elias tightened his fingers on the astrolabe and added, "We either finish this or we carry a useless stone back inland." He turned the instrument in his hands, searching for the matching notch that would marry brass to obsidian. The cliff threw the ocean-s sound up at them. The obsidian-s surface was pocked with salt and tiny grooves mapped in concentric lines. Moro kept his thumb in a deep furrow and felt a faint electric prick at the nail bed. He flexed his hand, the disc stilled. "How do we know what it wants?" he asked. "We have only conjecture and a field notebook with 3 smudged diagrams." His voice lowered. He moved to slide his palm across the central sigil and felt the carved bone cool beneath a thin film of algae. Elias laughed once, sharp. "You and your diagrams, Moro. The map is for use, not for archives." If it was meant to survive a flood, it was meant to be read in salt and wind. He lifted the astrolabe and tried to approximate the angle. As he worked, the brass ring scraped against a corroded rivet. The sound was concrete. It made Marin flinch, and it made Moro shift his grip. The first external interruption came when the obsidian disc flared. A pale line of light skittered along one of the carved star lines and slid into the night. All 3 of them froze on the action. The line was thin, like a cut of moonlight across stone, but it moved with intent and pooled at the disc's edge. Elias cursed. It reacted. He steadied his palms on the astrolabe and frowned at the disc. "If the alignment is wrong, the projection will be corrupted. We could lose the pattern to noise." He spoke technical terms and also fear. He had not been afraid in the caves before. Now his jaw clicked once, a small sound of restraint. Moro felt the first real emotion shift. Suspicion bent into doubt. He watched Elias with a measured gaze, saw the tremor in the younger man's wrist, and wondered whether the tremor sprang from incompetence or from desperation. He took the astrolabe from Elias with a motion that kept the instrument in 2 hands and steadied the ring into place. "Stand clear," he said. "Marin, read the rim postings, not the center. Elias, hold the outer ring steady. I will guide the rotation." He did not ask permission. His voice carried the authority of someone used to compiling fragments and making them cohere. They formed a tight working circle around the disc. Marin crouched low and held a reed wick from her satchel. She tapped the wick to the obsidian and a slow, clean flame took. The wick's light fell across the carved star lines and threw small shadows into the deeper grooves. Morrow watched the flame cut light across a particular triple marker, and he ordered, "Rotate 2 degrees toward the sea." "Stop on my mark." His measured fingertip traced a worn notch, and the disc ticked against a hidden bearing. Elias worked with fumbling efficiency. He matched the astrolabe to Morrow's steady hand, and with each tiny turn the disc replied by brightening a constellation line. The lines were not static. They flowed, like drawn ink warmed and running on parchment. The pattern that had been etched as rings and points began to slide into a configuration that showed directionality. Arrows of light, small glyphs that blinked in sequence. The second external event arrived when the projected light lifted off the disc and asked outward. A silhouette rose from the glow, the suggestion of towers and seawalls, a roofline broken by pinnacles that looked like ribs. The projection did not remain on the disc surface. It went beyond the stone and carved an image in the salt air above the Black Sea. Marin let out a short, startled laugh. "It's a city," she said. "It's showing the city." Her hands were steady now. Elias' mouth opened. No words came at first. Morrow's chest tightened with a different turn of feeling. Distrust shifted into astonished, cautious reverence. He had not expected a 3-dimensional projection. He had expected a mnemonic chart, not a living model. A voice came from nowhere, and every hair along Morrow's forearm rose. The sound was not human. It was a consonant, thinned intonation layered with a choir, like overtone. They all looked up. The high priest of the deep stepped from the projection, slow and ceremonial, his braided hair flecked with salt, the circlet low on his brow. The spectre did not speak plain words at first. He traced one ritual movement and left a thin trail of wet sand where his feet did not touch the rock. Morrow took a step back. The presence tightened the group. "We didn't invite that, Elias." His sentences came faster now. "We didn't mean to." He stopped because he saw the priest's hand pointing toward the coast. The projection shifted and a lighted street aligned with the disc's central mark. Marin's fingers tightened on the wick. "It wants a living ritual," she said. She sounded less like an archaeologist and more like someone reading a field manual of practice from a weathered margin note, not a diagram. "It expects motion. It expects sacrifice of a sort." The revelation forced another emotion shift. Morrow's cautious reverence warped into grim resolve. He felt the old scholarly steadiness harden into a choice. Preserve the mnemonic at any human cost, or refuse and let the record die. The knowledge in his field notebook, salt-stained diagrams with notation about bone, inlaid amulets, pressed against him like a ledger. He set his jaw and the scar along his left eyebrow pulled at the skin beneath it. Elias moved as if to help. "We can record it, Morrow. We can hold back the ritual and copy the configuration. Then we bury the disc." He spoke with practical cadence. Marin shook her head. "Copying will not capture the living alignment. The city shifts as the ritual completes. You cannot take a photograph of a function that requires participation." She spoke in short sentences. "If the alignment completes, it will open a channel. If we stop it, the channel collapses and we lose whatever memory it holds." Her eyes found Morrow's and did not look away. A gust of sea wind slapped at Elias' coat and stung the flush of his ears. "So what do we do?" he asked. The question returned agency to the trio. They argued with 3 different languages. Morrow's archival restraint, Marin's practical devotion to right, Elias' restless greed for discovery. The disc vibrated under Morrow's palm and the city projection rippled. A piece of the projected skyline dissolved into a corroded bell tower that swung and undid light from its top. The bell's projected shadow struck Marin's leg and made her stagger. Elias lunged to steady her, and in that motion his shoulder collided with Morrow's elbow. The astrolabe slipped a fraction. For a heartbeat they moved in a blur. Marin lunged to hold the disc. Elias reached to catch it. Morrow reacted by clamping both hands over the central sigil and pushing his weight away from the cliff rim. The motion sent a wave of water spray over the edge and slicked the rock under their boots. The mini-cliffhanger occurred when the disc tipped toward the sea on Elias's boot and spun like a small moon. For a tense second it looked as though it would topple and vanish into a black throat of foam. Maren screamed, a short sound with a consonant edge. "Let go!" She shouted at Elias and Morrow both. "If it falls, we lose the map, and whatever is waking will fade." Her voice was a command now. Elias reacted. He shoved the disc back toward the plateau with his shoulder and canted his weight to seize it. The brass astrolabe scraped against rock, and a fissure hissed, then split, a small arc of spray into the air. Morrow felt his fingertips burn with a sudden, cold electric pain, and he saw that the central sigil had cracked across a hairline in the wet light. The crack changed the terms. The projection reconfigured into a narrower channel of light, and the high priest's face moved closer, expression unreadable. He raised his conch, topped staff, and placed it lightly against the disc. For a moment the three human hands and the priest's staff made a single alignment. Morrow understood then that the map did not merely record. It transferred. He felt a pressure gather behind his eyes, like the first rise of a migraine but colder, filled with seawater tangible on the tongue. The high priest did not speak a plea. He indicated emotion lay a palm, accept the recall. Maren's face showed resolve. Elias' mouth formed a question, and then closed. "We have to decide now. Maren, we either let the mnemonic move through someone or we end it and leave nothing. Which truth matters more? That knowledge survives intact, or that we remain unchanged?" She pronounced the choices crisply and did not allow silence to lengthen. Morrow felt fear then, a physical contraction under the sternum that made his hands shake. He had imagined giving pieces of data to students, storing diagrams in lead-lined boxes. He had not imagined opening himself as a vessel. The idea of the high priest's memory of centuries of chant and star mapping pouring into his head felt like opening a sealed bottle and letting the sea pour through his throat. Elias broke the pause. "Do it, Morrow," he said. "You always keep the record. You keep things that should not be lost. If you refuse, we might lose everything." The sentence was blunt and the plea was naked. Elias's fingers flexed on the astrolabe, and he did not look away from Morrow. Morrow noticed then that Elias's need had a particular angle. He wanted discovery preserved not for scholarship alone, but for the advantage it might bring. He remembered a line in his notebook where Elias had once sketched the disc beside an imagined career ladder. That memory hardened Morrow's resolve into anger and then into the next emotion shift, determination. He placed his palm flat on the central sigil. The stone was cold and slightly rough with the residue of algae. He breathed and set his jaw. He did not say he would die, or that he would be changed. He simply laid himself where the map could touch him. "Rotate 1 degree, he told Elias, slowly. Maren ready the conch. His voice was steady and small. Elias turned the astrolabe. The brass groaned and caught on a burr. He cursed and forced the ring to move. Maren lifted the conch to her lips and sounded a single, hard call. The noise cut across the projection, and the high priest in the light answered by lowering his head. When the last notch clicked, the disc opened a narrow channel of liquid light that slid along Morrow's forearm and into the hollow at his wrist. The sensation was concrete. He felt a cool pressure that moved like moving water but smelled of beeswax and salt. Images came without language, rows of bone beads strung on cord, a specific chant measured in beats against a conch shell, the exact way the priest had tilted his circlet toward an incoming tide. It was not a blur. It was a sequence of motions and sounds, each with precise tactile and spatial information. Morrow's eyes watered with the sting of salt. He made no sound. The high priest lifted his staff and stepped fully from the projection, his shoulders shedding trickles of light that hit the rock and left damp marks. The priest's face inspected Morrow with a slow, unreadable look. Morrow felt an identity shift now. The map was not only giving memory, but looking for an inhabitant to carry it forward. The transfer compressed time. Morrow registered flashes of ritual steps that could align a constellation into a mnemonic phrase, details on how to string bone to mark cardinal directions, the exact pitch contours needed to trigger the astrolabe's mechanical bearings. With each new insertion he tasted seawater and something metallic, the tang of old coins. He also felt pain. A small, steady tearing at the back of his neck where the bone met skin, as if a seam was stitching into him. Elias sobbed once, a brief guttural sound that broke into almost laughter. "Gods," he said. "Morrow, say something." His voice trembled between awe and guilt. Morrow could not form a coherent sentence. He pressed both palms into the disc and felt fingernails cut into wet stone. A single remembered ritual phrase rose in him, as if he had always known it. His lips mouthed the syllables in sync with Marin's conch. The chant was not his, and yet his throat knew the shape of each consonant. The high priest laid his circlet on Morrow's brow with a practiced, ceremonial motion. The circlet's brass bit into skin and left a faint crescent of salt. At that moment Morrow understood what the transfer demanded, a relinquishing. He would carry the cosmology, but he would also lose something of his prior self. It was not a metaphor. He felt the edges of certain personal memories pull back, like pages being unpinned and set aside. He recalled the exact day he first read a marginal note in a 17th century manuscript. He could still trace the ink smudge on the page. But the vivid smell of his mother's kitchen in the village receded into a grayed picture. The loss arrived as a rearrangement. Some details sharpened, others withdrew. When the transfer slackened, the projected city stilled and folded back to the disk. The high priest stepped partly into shadow and then became almost holy light. He bent slightly and pressed the conch into Morrow's hand with a finality that felt like a blessing and a condemnation at once. Marin took the conch without hesitation. Elias sank to a wet knee and put his head into his palms. "We did it," he said. And the sentence had the flatness of someone who had just survived a storm, but who could not yet name what was lost. Marin sat back on her heels and stared at the disk. Her mouth moved without sound. She had gotten what she wanted, a working alignment, but the terms had cost them an unquantified portion of Morrow. The immediate physical aftermath forced them into action. Morrow leaned forward and vomited salt water into a cut in the rock. His legs trembled and he had to grip the disc to keep from sliding. Marin rushed to steady him, hands on his shoulders, and Elias caught his elbow. They hauled him up to a fold of tarpaulin and wrapped him in Marin's coat. The circlet lay beside them like an object removed from a body. Polished, heavy, with damp sand in its filigree, they worked with quick, concrete motions. Marin produced bandages and pressed them at Morrow's temple. Elias took out the field notebook and began to copy the new sequences in shorthand, his pen scratching in a hurry that betrayed both fear and necessity. Each scratch of ink was a deliberate attempt to fix the living motion into static records. Conversation came in clipped bursts. "Do we bury the disc?" Elias, eyes not leaving the circle of light where the projection had sat. Marin corrected him sharply with a look. "We done bury knowledge that can sing. We contain what can be dangerous and publish the rest. We make a controlled archive." She had the same tone she used when reading a marginal note aloud at a dig. Precise, certain of practical steps. Morrow's hands trembled as he wrote a line into the notebook. His handwriting was smaller now, condensed by muscle memory rather than by intent. He paused and tested a consonant in his mouth, the unfamiliar cadence of the rite still inside him. "We document the chart, but we do not broadcast the full ritual." He said, "We remove the circlet and the bone beads. We bury the complete sequence in separate caches. We record a public version for scholars, but keep the living alignment secured to a limited circle." He named his plan with the directness he used in academic notes. The plan was a containment strategy, a ledger of what to reveal and what to hide. Alias nodded and then argued. Who decides the circle? Who gets to read? He jabbed a finger at Moro. You, Marin. A committee. The quick exchange turned into a short debate with 3 to 5 rapid lines. They each interrupted and corrected one another until Marin cut them off with a single sentence. We decide tonight. We choose the safest option. Then we document our choices and sign. She held up the bandaged hands and the light caught on the brass astrolabe in Elias's lap. They made technical decisions in concrete terms. Bury the circlet in a lead, lined chest and seal it with black wax. Separate the bone beads into 3 catches and sink them beneath different sea ledges marked in the notebook. Copy the star lines into 2 cedar boxes and send one to an institutional collection under embargo. Elias insisted on photographing the whole operation. Marin refused flash photography and took only low, light plates. They argued about phrasing for a public note that would satisfy curiosity but hide the ritual mechanics. Moro wrote the note in neutral academic language and then crossed out 2 entire paragraphs that would have revealed the activation sequence. At dawn they dragged the damaged disc from the cliff to a makeshift shelter above the cove. The rock had a new hairline fissure running through the central sigil. Salt dried in pale veins along the fracture. They wrapped the disc in tarred linen and fastened it inside a small chest. Marin solemnized the act by placing the conch inside the chest as a reminder of the ritual's cost. Elias sealed the chest with a strip of copper and a loop of wire. That afternoon the 3 of them formalized a pact. They wrote their names and a short conditional clause in Moro's notebook. Elias wrote with shaky strokes. Marin's signature was tight and compact. Moro's block print looked steadier than he felt. They agreed to share a redacted record and to maintain custody protocols that required 2 signatories to remove any sealed item. The act of signing changed the weight of their relationship. It made choice institutional. Days passed and routine returned like a tide. Moro retreated inland to his study and began the slow labor of copying the living patterns into a format he could teach. He positioned the astrolabe under a lamp and sketched the angles with precise numbers. He rehearsed the chant in the quiet room and practiced the exact tongue shapes until the syllables sat correctly on his palate. He found himself waking at odd hours with the ache at the base of his skull, an afterburn of the transference. A subtle shift had taken place in him that his friends noticed. Marin watched him trace diagrams with a finger rather than with a pen. Elias watched Moro correct the pitch of a hum with an internal ear that had not existed before. Both of them mentioned the changes without naming them. Moro called the changes professional alterations and smiled to hide the way some tender domestic memory had paled. He took longer to recall his father's laugh. He could, with perfect recall, recite the precise order of knots used to fix salt, crystal cords to a staff. One morning, while copying a particularly complex sequence, Moro found a narrow strip of paper folded into the spine of his field notebook. The paper held a tiny sketch, an extra margin note he had not made. It was a diagram of the circlet's filigree with a minute notation. Bury under north ledge, 3 knocks. The handwriting was his, but the loop on the numeral 7 was slightly different. He read the note aloud and his voice betrayed nothing, but he felt a precise prickle of alarm race from the base of his skull to his palms. He took the circlet from its crate, a small, ceremonial loop of blackened gold with salt crystals in its recesses, and set it on the desk. His hand hovered and then withdrew. He imagined the pact again and the signed line in his own pen. He had sworn to keep the living parts sealed, yet the marginal note suggested a contingency he had not written. It suggested that some part of the high priest's memory was still active in his hand. Moro made a decision that had nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with method. He would document everything and then secure the residual artifact in a hidden location where only those he trusted could access it. He wrote an inventory with time, date, and 2 signatures required for removal. He placed the circlet in the tarred chest and locked it. He set the chest inside a small wooden crate, nailed it shut, and then carried it to the edge of the study grounds where a low, wind-swept hedge grew. He buried it beneath a layer of stone that matched the coastal ledge and placed 3 plain rocks atop the spot. As he worked, the familiar sea choir hummed in the back of his head. He paused, hand on the shovel, and felt the final emotion shift settle. Determination folded into a wary vigilance. He would guard knowledge without allowing it to rule him. A week later, a subtle announcement arrived at the door. A wet scrap of seaweed taped to the underside of the study latch with a small brass ring tied to it. Someone had placed it there with slow care. Morrow picked it up and turned the ring in his fingers. It was an old ring, scored by salt and with a single hairline scar where someone had tried to carve a sigil and stopped. The ring did not belong to Marin or Elias, and it matched nothing in his archives. He took it to the window and sat down. The ocean lay in grey folds beyond the trees, and the sound came in measured. He pressed his thumb against the ring and felt a faint warmth, like a fingertip pressed against metal in a drafty room. He could not say whether the warmth was real or conjured by a memory the map had left in him. Marin and Elias arrived that evening. They ate in the kitchen with the practical clatter of people who have decided to keep going. They spoke rarely about the ritual in full terms. Their conversation ranged from shipping the redacted plates to a university archive to the logistics of their pact. Their jokes were short. Elias a story of how he misread a tide chart and nearly lost a rowboat. He laughed and then sobbed. Marin suggested a safe deposit box for the copies of the sequence and drew up a list of names who could handle the archive without allowing the living right to leak. At last, they went to Morrow's study and stood over his desk. He held the ring in the light and they watched his hand. "Elias, do you still feel it?" Morrow pressed his thumb and then said, "I feel the alignment like a pressure under the same ridge as a compass needle. I do not feel my childhood kitchen as much as I used to. I feel the bone bead order with precise fingers." The words were short. He did not dramatize them. Marin reached out and covered his hand with hers. "You kept the record alive and you kept our pact, Morrow," she said. "That matters. We owe you nothing but the truth in guarded doses." She named him as she always did when she wanted to bind him to fact. They stood in a small quiet. Elias broke it with a practical question. "Do we publish anything at all?" he asked. Morrow looked at the ring and then at the signatures in his notebook. He turned a page and revealed 2 columns of numbers and a line that read in his hand, "Sealed sequence, access requires 2 signatures." He closed the ledger and set it face down. "We publish a reduction," he said, "enough to satisfy inquiry and to redirect curiosity into safer questions. The living pattern stays contained." He looked at both of them in turn. "We agree now and we sign now. 1 more copy will be buried at sea." No catalogue, he offered the practical resolution, as if listing steps in an experiment. They signed. Each one made their mark with a short, deliberate stroke. The act of signing did not erase what had happened. It distributed responsibility. They left the study with a quiet that carried the weight of the pact. Days later, alone at his desk, Morrow began to copy the fractured celestial sequences into a fresh-field notebook. He used a steady hand. At the margins he wrote the precise angle measures and the chord progressions he had learned in the transfer. He noted the smell of salt on the circlet and the exact pressure that began at the hollow of his wrist when the channel opened. He wrote as if engraving law. A faint choir, like resonance, came from the window, a distant layering of tones that matched the chant inside him. Morrow pushed his chair back and set his hand on the desk. The circlet's 3 rocks over the buried spot near the hedge pressed cold into his palm through cloth. He did not go to check the site. He obeyed the pact. The final event in the chapter was not dramatic. It was small and precisely recorded. There was a gentle knock at his door, 3 knocks in the rhythm the margin note had specified. He did not stand up immediately. He counted silently, then rose, smoothed his coat, and walked to the door. He opened it to find no one on the step. Only a scrap of paper weighted with a plain pebble. The pebble had a faint trace of salt on one side. Morrow picked up the paper. On it was a single line written in a hand he did not fully recognize, but that matched certain loops he had seen in the high priest's circlet filigree. The alignment listens. Keep the watch. The sentence was concrete and direct. Morrow folded the note and placed it in the inner pocket of his coat. He shut the door and returned to his desk. He set the circlet's ring into a small drawer and closed it with a click. He wrote one final inventory line and then, with a precise motion, he screwed the page under a strip of glued leather. He laid the field notebook back in its box and took a breath that left the salt taste in his mouth. The sound in the study was the rustle of paper and the distant murmur of sea. He felt the map's presence like a foreign instrument in his chest, useful, exact, and keenly costly. He did not pretend the cost was moralized or romantic. He had paid a measure of himself. He had also preserved an order of knowledge that, in certain hands, might steer others to the same dangerous edge. He closed the notebook and felt his fingers tremble, not from fear now, but from the precise work of holding two things at once: the obligation to truth and the duty to contain its worst directions. When he went to bed that night, he lay awake for a short time and catalogued the day's items in his head. The circlet, the bone beads divided, the tarred chest sealed under the hedge, the signed pact. He rehearsed the lines he would use in a future deposition should the day come when someone asked. He let the memory of the city's projection settle into a measured list of coordinates and steps, rather than into an image that could lure others without context. The chapter ends on a concrete note. He rose at first light and walked to the hedge. He brushed away the 3 stones and took the chest from its shallow grave. He set it in the back of his cart and drove it to a coastal shelf some distance from the cove where the tide would keep casual hands from finding it. He placed the chest beneath another stone slab, set the circlet within, and then stepped back and hammered a small bronze peg into the ground beside it. He marked the peg in his notebook with a coordinate and 2 lines of ciphered text for the pact. He sealed the ledger and locked the study. The last sentence of the chapter is simple and situational. Dra. Morrow closes the study door, keys the lock, and walks inland while the distant sea sound carries the faint echo of the high priest's chorus back to the cove.